the text? How about the code here? Can you see this okay? Is that legible?
Maybe bump it up one class. What do people think?
How's that?
Maybe one more.
One more.
One more. All right.
Perfect.
This looks so gigantic to me right now, but it's very easy to read. Cool. All right. Well, we'll get into the code in a second. I'm gonna start with my little presentation here. So yeah, my talk is called React. What's the big deal? Because I do think it's worth talking about why React is a big deal. I have a GitHub repo for this whole presentation. It's a little bit old, so it's using a slightly older version of React. It covers most of the same stuff, but I have a series of commits you can follow that can sort of go along with the stuff that we're going to go through here if you want to refer to it later. But I've also adapted a couple of things here for Vite, and I'm just going to kind of have to improvise a bit because the demo project it creates is subtly different from the normal Create React app one. But if you have any questions after this, I'm going to have, my contact info will be available after this, and you can absolutely feel free to reach out to me with any questions you have. But yeah, let's talk a little bit about React. So what exactly is it? It's a JavaScript library for creating views. That is really all it is in and of itself. We're going to talk about, I mentioned the ecosystem, and by that I mean everybody developing in it and all of the tools that have kind of sprung up around it. We're going to talk a bit about that. But React itself is basically it just creates views, things that the user can directly interact with on a web page or a mobile app, which we'll talk about a little bit. I'm not going to go into anything specific about React Native, but as a mobile developer, that is pretty much exclusively what I work in right now. And it allows me to make cross-platform apps for iOS and Android using a single React-based code base. And it's a slightly different version of React, but pretty much all the same stuff applies, which is really cool. So all of the stuff you're learning in React now is going to help you if you're ever interested in mobile dev. It provides a nice little bridge into that world, which has been the experience of a few of the developers I've worked with, and it's really been great. So what exactly makes React special? You'll notice there's an asterisk on special there because special doesn't mean unique, and that's more true all the time. There's a lot of other libraries that are not unlike React, like Vue or Angular, and many of them have become more React-like. They've sort of coalesced around some of the same standards since I started doing this talk. So some of this stuff will carry over for that, but I still think it makes React special. And again, this is why it was exciting to me as a front-end developer when it first came out, why it seemed like something worth learning. And the big four things I've identified, this is just me subjectively, why I think it's special, are the way it uses components to build views, JSX, the sort of markup language that it uses, the diffing algorithm, which sounds complicated, but you don't have to worry about it, and the ecosystem. Components are basically, they are just self-contained bits of user interface that let you break up your whole app into pretty much as many pieces as you want and let every single part of it focus on a single thing. It doesn't always work out quite that cleanly, of course. A real web app is going to get complicated, and these things have to talk to each other, and that's where most of the complexity of the code you're going to be writing is going to come from. But essentially, it just makes it very easy to just self-contain these little pieces of like view logic, which is one of the big strengths of it. And we're going to see some very direct examples of that in the workshop. JSX, I call a Frankenstein's monster of HTML and JavaScript, but a good monster. It's you may have seen a little bit of it already. It looks a lot like HTML. It allows you to very kind of quickly and fairly seamlessly mix JavaScript directly into your markup. This is one of the big things that did not exist in the pre-React days for the most part. There were some earlier tools like jQuery that kind of tried to do this, but essentially in the olden days, when you had a website, web pages were originally designed with pretty much just HTML in mind, just markup, just code that is describing how things are laid out on the screen. It was not really meant to be any more complex than that. JavaScript gradually started to introduce more and more complicated logic and actual interactivity that you as a developer could take advantage of as browsers got more advanced. I should open up the chat so I can see what you're saying, by the way. in case anyone has any questions. If you do have a question, oh, I see somebody is asking single page application. If that is in fact a question. Do you want to elaborate on that? I can.
Sorry, I'm in the elevator right now.
No problem. I just want to make sure I'm not missing any questions here. I realized I didn't have the chat open.
Oh no, I was trying to like attempt to answer what made React special.
Oh, okay, got it.
And explain to me that like it was a single page application, and so it didn't have to keep on making a request to the server. That's
true. That is also true. Yeah. This is something that's easy to kind of forget about, but again, I'm talking about the olden days here. And this is still true of many websites. When you load a new page, when the URL changes, you are completely loading. Originally, you were loading an entirely new page. Your browser might cache some of it, but it was all new stuff, essentially. So if you wanted to, say, carry over, information about your user who is logged in from page to page, that started to become more complicated. And other aspects you might have been doing. React essentially loads is really just one page and does not rely on the browser constantly downloading and managing all this new data. React is doing it by itself. And there were earlier attempts at this that people were kind of doing it before React, but it was clunky for a lot of reasons. And one of the big reasons is what I was getting at just now, that JavaScript, you could put JavaScript anywhere in an HTML page. You still can do that. But getting it to interact with your markup was complicated. You essentially needed to kind of search through your own markup and try to identify the thing that you wanted to change and then change it manually, essentially, in a block of code that was nowhere near it. They were always kind of living in these separate worlds, and it was very easy to make mistakes this way. What JSX aimed to change, and I think does it really well, is figure out a way that you can put dynamic, JavaScript content and controls into your markup in a way that is like easy enough to follow, that doesn't become wildly complex. Because the other option that I don't think anybody really used in the old days was to just let the JavaScript write your markup and turn everything into code, and that would just be a nightmare. It wouldn't. The nice thing about markup, the nice thing about HTML is it's very easy to just look at it usually and see what it's supposed to look like. You can understand what it's going to translate to visually. It's a nice, simple, kind of one-to-one relationship. And the more you try to work JavaScript into that, the more you start to muddy that up, and your brain has to do more work to try to understand what it's going to see. So JSX is trying to kind of thread the needle and be like the midpoint between those two. And that's essentially what it is. It's actually technically optional. You don't need to use JSX. I don't know anybody who doesn't, but I think when React first launched, JSX didn't exist yet. And this is an example of some JSX code here and some JavaScript code that I think is doing the same thing. I say I think because when I made these images, it was like 5 years ago, and I don't even know if this is still what it does under the hood, and I don't care because I'm never going to do this. Like, no one is ever going to write this. But if you really want to, you can just write out JavaScript. That's what's, that would also be functional. But again, I don't know anybody who does that. The diffing algorithm. This is huge. This is where I think React kind of changed. Like, it introduced a whole new way of thinking, and you see it even outside of JavaScript and HTML in other forms of front-end development. This idea that when the data changes, you essentially create a connection between the data and your UI, and then you step away. And when the data changes, the UI should just update, and you shouldn't have to think about it. Because back when you had your little blocks of JavaScript running their logic, and you had your markdown somewhere else, and they were vaguely connected, it really fell on the JavaScript to crawl through that markup, find what it needed to change, and change it anytime the data changed. And you needed to say that explicitly as a developer. If you were making some kind of a chat window and you received a chat from somebody, you needed to make sure that you manually built this new chat bubble for the person who had said something and place it in the right place. And this became most of the code you were writing was logic like this. Like, how do I take this data, which I know has just changed, and show that to the user? And it also became the place where you made by far the most of your mistakes and was often the hardest to figure out what was going wrong. So React does instead. We're going to see how it does it, essentially, or at least how it does it for you writing the code. I don't know how the algorithm is probably pretty complex. I don't know what it does. I've never looked at it. You don't need to look at it. You do need to understand some of the ways it works and doesn't work, because there's certain interesting edge cases where maybe you don't want the UI to update right away or things like that. But you can get into that later. For the time being, the important thing to think of is essentially when my data updates, the UI is just going to update and I don't even have to worry about it. And that just saves so many headaches. And then I guess I skipped the ecosystem, didn't I? Okay, well, there should be a slide in here for the ecosystem. That was the other thing. Part of React's strength, like any popular framework, is its sheer popularity. It can be fun sometimes to work in more obscure things. But you run into this problem where if you have a weird issue, you are inevitably going to be Googling strange error messages. That's sometimes what people jokingly say half of being a developer is just Googling error messages, but it kind of is, and it becomes a bit of a craft. And it's especially difficult when you don't have a lot of other people working in the same arena as you. So one of the great things about React is that everybody's using it. It's extremely widely used in many different kinds of applications. And there's a very good chance that if you run into a problem, somebody else has had the same issue, and you can get help right away. If not, you can ask in many different, on Stack Overflow or in a GitHub thread or something like that. And you're likely to get an answer and people who can help because they know and understand React as a framework. This also means that there's a lot of tools out there. If you're trying to do something complicated, the first thing I always do when I need to introduce some bit of functionality that I don't immediately know how to do or I haven't done before, I just do a quick search to see, has somebody already built a package for this? And a good amount of the time they have. Someone has there's an NPM package out there that gets, and you check the number of downloads to make sure that a lot of people are actually using it. Has it been updated recently? And there's a really good chance that all of these things are true, that someone has solved this problem for you and you can just plug and play with their solution, hopefully. There's risks sometimes to using a lot of other people's code instead of writing your own because you don't understand necessarily how it works. But as far as getting up off the ground and like getting something working early on, it's like amazingly valuable to have that kind of a community around who's just doing all this stuff and putting it all out there for everyone else to use. So that's another really big, great thing about React, which I think does set it apart from most of the other alternatives at the moment. I mean, like I mentioned, Vue and Angular, those are fairly popular, but they don't seem to have quite the same reach. So if you do end up using those, that's something you have to consider. But essentially, yeah, that is really all React is, because the rest of it is that ecosystem. It is those tools and all the different things that people build on top of React. It's just the view layer, and the structure of your actual app is going to come from things like, you may hear about Redux, for example. That's a good example, a very popular one. We've used that a lot. It's a way of managing the state of your entire application in a fairly structured way, so you can kind of keep sense of everything if you have a lot of stuff going on. Although React has recently introduced some elements of the things that Redux does into React itself. So this may be changing. React itself is starting to get to a point where you don't need as much third-party structure to make an app. You can build everything with just React. You do need backend structures for the most part, unless you're doing something really simple. You probably need some kind of a backend. You need some sort of a database somewhere. And that may be anything like Rails or Node or Django or there's many, many, many ways to build a backend. I'm not really a backend person, so I can't speak to that. But all of that stuff can plug into React. React can talk to anything that has an API. It doesn't really care what the backend is. It's completely removed from that, which is really nice. And like I said at the bottom, you can build your own structure too. That's kind of what I was getting at. React is increasingly letting you make a full-fledged application using just its own tools. Context was one of the first things that they added that let you do that. That's essentially a way to share data between a whole bunch of different components that don't necessarily know that the others exist. And increasingly hooks, we'll talk a little bit about those. Hooks are a really big thing. They added those a few years ago, and they are essentially a way to take some of the logic out of that really previously you needed to have inside of a component and kind of make it this free-floating thing that you could pull into multiple places. They're not as complicated as they sound. They're actually pretty simple, but but there's the sort of hook pattern is becoming a big thing in React. Cool. So I figured at this point would be, well, let me stop for some questions first. Does anyone have any questions, anything they want to bring up? Feel free to either just shout it out in the Zoom or you can put it in the chat. Okay, well, we'll keep going, but again, stop me anytime. We have until like 11:30, so we'll do breaks and stuff, but we have until 11:30, so there's plenty of time to stop me. I intend this to be frequently interrupted.
Quinn, I did have a question real quick.
Great.
So, you know, React is not necessarily brand new, but like, you know, when it was brand new, and you know, as more companies kind of adopt building stuff in React, how difficult is it to kind of migrate an existing application to React, if that makes any sense?
That depends a lot on the application. Yeah, like I said, if you already had like a separate view layer of some kind, like, so for example, like TXI used to do almost all Rails work, for example, and when I started at TXI, Rails was generally handling the views in addition to the backend stuff. And now if we build a Rails app, it's like we almost certainly have a React front end and a Rails backend, and it kind of becomes separate. And they talk to each other through, you know, an API. So if you have it like the latter case, very easy to swap out React. You know, you still have to rewrite a whole bunch of stuff, but since you've already created this API that is just kind of this way of a front end of some kind getting that data, it's not going to be that hard to switch over to something else. The problem is probably that's not the case, right? If you are creating a React app on an existing app that is handling it the way Rails used to do it, you know, that there's this whole complicated, that really falls on the back end people more though, than the front end. Like you as a front end dev, if would essentially be just building from scratch, and the back end people have to do all the work to change what used to be, you know, something that was thinking about these individual pages, not a single page application, but like I'm on this page, it needs this data, you know, I need to do this bit of like, you know, kind of massaging the data to put it in a shape that the view can see, and they need to take all of that out and turn it into an API and then hand you that as the front end dev. So, but if you're just on the React side, probably not that hard. You just, again, you need to rewrite a lot of code, but you shouldn't have to like, you wouldn't really be changing anything. You would be doing something new and just swapping that out.
That makes sense. Thanks.
Sure. But yeah, dealing with legacy projects though is wildly varying. So like there's many situations where just like you could be in a very bizarre place and there's just no precedent for it. But that's part of the fun of being a developer.
I just wanted to mention, Quinn, this is awesome. Thank you. And Zach, that's a great question. And I just want to encourage everyone to ask Quinn lots of questions. So Quinn, I'm totally going to put you on the spot. Like, we're going to be using a lot of React. This is the time. And also bear in mind, like, we're shifting into the second half of the course. And a lot of that is going to be talking more about the professional skills that will help everyone here, all of us, succeed both in technical interviews and when we start our first job. And what I like to say is, like, as a junior software developer, like, kind of my experience has been the rule is like silence is golden. If you're not asking questions or asking for help, people will assume you're doing great. So honestly, the most critical job skill, and very consistently the feedback we get back from mock interviewers, is that people don't ask enough questions. So I'm just gonna nudge the entire class and push everyone a bit to ask you to all ask like 2 questions. Like, if this becomes a question deluged workshop, I think, Quinn, I don't want to speak for you, but I think we would be thrilled and excited.
Yeah, and I will say too, like doing this over Zoom, it is a little harder because in the, you know, when I started doing this, we were still in an office and there were some remote people, but it was nice to be able to kind of walk around and see people who were like maybe struggling with something or having trouble. And frequently I had to go up to people and say like, hey, can I help you with that? Because obviously if you're, you know, intensely focused on something, you probably don't want to ask a question, but like, Yeah, it
Great
does
point.
kind of fall on all of you to be a little more proactive and ask me stuff, because I have no idea if you're struggling with this or confused or something if I don't hear anything. But yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, and Adam, yeah, like if we would get through nothing, none of the code in this, and you just ask me questions, that is probably more useful than going through my actual examples, because all of this stuff you can find tutorials for. But I'm really happy to, yeah, just like talk back and forth and go through some of the stuff that specifically you want to know.
Yeah, Quinn, thank you. And yeah, it's a great point about Zoom. And also bear in mind, probably like a lot of your interviews will happen over Zoom. So now is a good time to practice asking questions in that environment as well. I'll keep an eye too on the hands up participants channel and the chat, and I won't be able to do a perfect job, but Quinn, I'll try and shout out when I see raised hands and questions there, because I know screen management is a thing.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and there's a great question in the chat now about what's the future of React? Do you think it'll be used in 10 years?
I'm not going to try to make predictions 10 years out. In 5 years, yes. You know, like it will, I think it will absolutely be as important as it is now in 2 to 3 years, just because things don't move quickly enough for anything to really overthrow it. Like in 5 years, it'll still exist at the very least because of legacy code. Maybe by that time, something else has come along. Yeah, it's interesting. I don't like, for my particular perspective is interesting here because, again, I'm a mobile developer and I usually use React Native, and React Native has been like a big game changer for us in the way it really finally delivered on the promise of a cross-platform framework, because those existed before. There were ways to write an app that would work in iOS and Android, but they always had these kind of gotchas, and there were like just they didn't really make it that much easier. React actually made it. So I really am like significantly reducing the amount of work it takes to make an app for both platforms. So I don't see walking away from it anytime soon, especially because I keep looking around, and the closest competitor I think it's had really is Flutter, which is Google's thing. And I don't trust Google not to just abandon stuff, even if it's good, because I still very sore about Google Reader. So like I wouldn't throw I played around with it a little bit and it's fun, but like there just isn't anything really coming up that seems to be like a genuine competitor. So that's like, for me, makes React very significant. And I do again like that I can do front end web work again after having not touched it in like a decade, because it's just React and I know React. And I like that people can come on board our mobile projects who might not know a lot of mobile. So that connection there is significant for my particular work. As far as like the broader industry, it's a little harder to say. There might be things coming up, but like there's also things like Next.js, which are built on React. And I think maybe that's what you might start seeing more of, are these things. And it looks like Vite might be kind of like that, if I'm understanding. Vite's not React specific though, right?
That's correct.
Yeah, you can use it for Vue and Angular and different ones.
Okay. Yeah, I feel like maybe you'll start seeing more of that kind of stuff, just like these, and that's been around for a bit, but yeah, maybe people will coalesce around these kind of slightly more structured things that are using React under the hood. And the thing is, like, if something like that got really huge and then it decided we're just going to ditch, or maybe Vite's a bad example, but like Next.js, for example, something like that, where it's like you're using this and it's sitting on top of another framework, and they decide to swap that out with a different framework because it works better, that could be an interesting way where that changes, but it's really hard to predict. So here's the thing though, do not worry. I know this is something that I think a lot of people who are just learning coding get worried about. Do not worry about learning the wrong thing. You're never learning the wrong thing. As long as you're learning something, like all of that knowledge is going to in some way transfer over to a new framework. It just keeps getting easier to pick up new stuff because everybody's building off the knowledge that came before and the patterns that came before. So you're not going to find yourself, it's not like learning Japanese when you should have learned German. You know, it's not like these totally different things. Like there is a commonality to all the knowledge that you're going to be gaining that will be useful. So I would say don't sweat it. But I think below that, someone has create React app versus Vite. I don't know enough to say that yet because I just used Vite for the first time. It was very fast, partly because it doesn't install the node modules right away, but I kind of like that. I don't think that really matters though. Like all the complex stuff is going to be the stuff that you build yourself, really, not so much like where you get started, I think. Killed by google.com. I haven't seen that. I should check that out. Did I choose mobile development by choice or just the way my career has gone? Sort of, yeah. It was something that interested me early on. I think my first professional mobile dev job, like just doing some contract work, was in 2012, and I was pretty new to it. I actually, my first real coding experience came out of the Flash world for the most part, which I still remember very fondly. It was a great way for someone like me who had more of a kind of a designer art background, who didn't, I was not a computer science major. I took one class in college and that was it. Was pretty helpful, but I came from like, I was more interested in like the creative end of these tools, and Flash was this cool bridge point kind of between just like, doing cool fun animations and like actually starting to code a bit. And I was playing around with that a lot. I'm not the only person I know either in mobile development who came to it through Flash specifically. It seems to have like, and mobile development similarly is kind of a weird eclectic group for the most part. I feel like you will often find mobile devs who didn't like study computer science, who don't have a lot of the like foundational knowledge, but like just are kind of tinkerers who got really into it and just kind of learned as we went. So in my case though, I originally I did like kind of graphic design and animation for a while for my job. And then I spent time with some friends of mine doing a video game for a few years. We did a massively multiplayer crafting game, not unlike Minecraft or Terraria. It was a 2D game that was all online. We did that for a few years and we were modestly successful, but not enough to keep it going. So what ended up happening with me was we started picking up some contract work. We started doing some Android work. We didn't really know Android, but we kind of learned as we went. Then TXI ended up needing some Android help right around the time where we were kind of running out of money and needed to get real jobs. And so I just sort of slipped in there. But I will say that, yeah, it was sort of a fake it till you make it thing for me. I definitely didn't really have the skills, but I had the desire to learn, and that helped me out a lot when I started at TXI, and it ended up being a great supportive environment. So I was able to get up to speed just through working at the job. I see a hand up, and there's also a chat question. I'm not sure who to answer first.
Oh, just a quick question. Did you happen to use the Micromedia from way back then?
Yeah, I think I started using Flash when it was still Macromedia. It was like Flash 8, and they were bought by Adobe shortly after that. My big thing was I wanted to make like old school point and click adventure games with it. So I like made a little engine that did that. And I actually released it for free in a very small community built around like 5 people, but they got really into it for a little bit. So that was kind of fun. And that was kind of where I like the code I was writing was absolutely terrible, but it worked. It did eventually work, and you could make a little game out of it. So I think like, yeah, mobile felt a little bit similar to me. It was based around these paradigms of very simple user interactions, very friendly stuff. And I think similarly attracted people like me who weren't very skilled, but were excited to just try things. So the other question was, is React a framework? Yeah, in fact, I think one of my slides says it's not really a framework, like, or maybe at least it used to. It's hard to say what it is because, yeah, like a framework sort of implies like a kind of opinionated structure about how your app should be built. And React doesn't really do that. Like Redux sort of does that, although that also gives you a lot of freedom, right? But like I mentioned Rails, right? Rails is a backend framework, but it is very much a framework. Like you put certain files here, and they are supposed to talk to other files here in this particular. They're supposed to have this relationship. It's all supposed to use this pattern called model view controller, and there's pretty strict ideas about like where your data lives and where you pull your data out of the database and do stuff to it, and you can break all these rules, but like the rules are there. And React doesn't really have that. No, it essentially like gives you one. We'll see them when we open up the code and look at the project that's created. But it's like, here's your one component. This is your app component. Go nuts. And at that point, it steps back and doesn't really do anything. So yeah, what you do after that is kind of up to you and the conventions, like of, you know, where you're working and the team you're working with and anything else like that. And if you're working by yourself, you just kind of do what's comfortable to you. So I can't speak to Angular as an alternative, but I will say, yeah, React for better and worse, like really doesn't give you much guidance on how you build or structure your app, like a bigger app. You're kind of on your own, so you have to make those decisions yourself, basically. And yeah, I think ultimately, like doing it in a way that's going to work for your team and anyone else who's working on the particular project that you're on is the most important thing, much more so than any kind of industry standards. And someone asks, have I explored Expo? Yeah, I've played with Expo a little bit. Expo is actually, if any of you are interested in mobile dev at all, I would definitely start with that. It's a great place to start if you're totally new. Essentially, it lets you very quickly get an app up and running and even running on your phone. Through the way it works is, because this is the thing that React, this is the big difference between React Web and React Native. If you're coming over from the website and you want to do some mobile work, you're going to have to deal with actually getting your app on a device. It's pretty easy in Android. It's extremely annoying on iOS. And probably you have an iOS device. I mean, you maybe have an Android device, but iOS is more popular and iOS is really obnoxious. It's a very locked down kind of ecosystem on the phone, and you have to get these, you have to become a developer, you have to pay to be a developer. It's $100 a year. You have to create certificates and provisioning profiles and download all this stuff, and Xcode will try to manage it for you, but it's a little funky. Expo kind of just throws all that out the window, and essentially you download the Expo app and you can just point it at a QR code right on your terminal and open up the app, and you're running the app on your phone. It's really cool. It doesn't have a lot of utility when you're building like when you're at our point where we have this whole kind of suite of React Native tools we know and we use, and some of them don't work with Expo. It doesn't really give us much of an advantage. So there's not really much of a reason for me to use it on a day-to-day basis, but as a teaching tool, it is excellent. So yeah, highly recommended. Now, game dev outside of indie stuff is super hard on hours, and not really, yeah. Yeah, this is a bit of a, like, I've never really worked in the true game industry. I've only really heard bad things about it. You know, we were like an indie group, like there were only 3 of us. So we kind of, I think we were reasonable. I mean, those guys were hard workers. I was probably the laziest of the 3 of us, so I didn't really have my nose to the grindstone for those few years when I worked at it. I was mostly doing art too, so it was kind of a different job. If you're looking around at the different areas of tech, where and there are many different areas of tech you could potentially work in with, you know, the skills you're learning here, and you're interested in the game industry, yeah, I would probably be cautious. It doesn't have a very good reputation for treating its workers very well. But again, that's not really speaking from experience. This is mostly hearsay, but it's been a consistent message I've heard from that end of things. And I hope it changes, because I love video games, and I think people who make them should have great jobs and like great benefits and lots of work-life balance. I'll wait longer for, you know, my DLC. Oh yeah, somebody asked, pay to be a developer. Yeah, you don't have to pay to be an Apple developer. Well, yeah, you do. You have to pay to be an Apple developer. You essentially do it in order to distribute on using App Store Connect or the Apple developer portal. You do need to pay for that. Yeah, it's annoying. It's not a prohibitive expense for most people, but it's just a little irritating thing they do. Yeah. Android's free, so if you just want to start with Android, you know, maybe start there. And again,
oh, sorry. Is it still the case that you can only develop for iOS if you have a Mac? I think I heard that. Yeah.
There used to be a thing, actually Adobe, before it killed Flash, did have this little thing it would let you do it on like a PC, and you could somehow get it onto an iOS device, but I don't think anybody's doing anything like that anymore. Now there are options like, for example, this is very complicated stuff that we can't get into now, but like there are like things like GitHub Actions. There are online you know, continuous integration, CI, you'll probably hear continuous integration, CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous deployment. You'll probably hear these terms. at some point. I don't know if you've gone over them already, but there's a lot of services online that do automated building of apps and then distributing them. Like Bitrise is one, App Center is another one. Some of these have free plans. And so theoretically, you could write some code and deploy it to your device through this roundabout internet way without actually having a Mac. It would be very hard to debug things when they go wrong, but theoretically you could do that. So yeah, that's obviously, maybe a place to start if you're interested in this and you don't want to, invest in a Mac right away. Although if you do, I would definitely get like a refurbished one or something, because you can get them reasonably cheap if you're okay to go back a few years. They tend to last. But yeah, you're pretty much locked into the Mac ecosystem. That's fine by me. I like Macs, but if you don't, then yeah, it's an annoying thing that you're kind of stuck with.
Nice. Thanks.
Sure. Cool. Yeah, it sounds like everybody's hearing the same thing about game dev as me. Yeah, it really sucks. And again, I love video games. I really wish it were like a great space to work in. I think maybe it could be someday, but we'll see where it goes. Anyone else have any questions before we move on?
Actually, I do. Are you gonna show us like how to like develop an Android app in React?
That wasn't going to in this, but it'd be cool if I could jump into that. That would be a little too complicated, I think, to get into this. But just know
Personal
that the
project.
stuff. Yeah, that's something. You know what? Feel free to reach out to me after this if you have questions about that. That's something I'd be happy to throw some resources your way and that kind of thing. Everything we're going to go through here, though, applies to React Native. It's like React Native is a little bit different, but it's basically works in the same way. So, yeah, I would start by looking at Expo. They have some great documentation, great like get up and running little quick projects. Yeah, I agree, Adam. Great questions, everybody. Thank you. Yeah, Expo would be a good place to start. But again, reach out to me and I'll see if I can set you on the right path there. Cool. Well, if there are no other questions right now, and again, interrupt me at any point, let's actually dive into a little bit of the code here. So I went ahead and I used Vite for the first time to make this app sitting on my desktop right now. I don't think it's actually running. It's not. So I'm going to go ahead and run it. And it breaks. Oh, because I'm not actually in the project. That's why. Okay, well, you know what? Let's take a moment here. Can everyone see my terminal? Is this big enough? Okay, great. This is a mistake you're going to make all the time, constantly, if you're me, trying to run something in the wrong place or in a so good to just take a quick look at this error here. This is what happened because it's looking. I tried to run an npm command in my desktop, which is empty aside from this folder, and so it looked around. What it did was it looked around for a package JSON. And when we go through the code in a second, you'll see that again. That's how it knows it's in an npm zone, essentially, and it tries to run something in that file specifically. And it didn't find it, so it gave me this error. So if you ever see this error, you're probably just in the wrong place. Very easy mistake to make, but it's good, like, to get familiar with common error messages. Great. So, all right, I'm running npm run dev. Doesn't look like it opened up my browser automatically, so I'm going to go ahead and open that. Great, and here is the Vite. Can everyone see the standard Vite project? You can't see my chat window, right? That's like just for me. I want to make sure it's not blocking stuff.
Correct. Yeah, the chat, the menu bar, any participants thing, anything like that, Zoom doesn't share over the.
Good. Yeah, so this looks a lot like this Create React app basic project. It has this little counter down here, which I was going to teach you how to build. So now we're just going to look at what they did. It's essentially the same thing. Yeah, this is just the basic file running. So let's take a look at the code right now and see what's actually running here. So first off, as we saw, when I tried to run dev before, when I was in the wrong place, it looked for a package JSON and didn't find one. So this is kind of your central file. This is something that's pretty important. You probably won't need to mess with it too much. You don't need to add a lot of stuff, but it's what gets modified by a lot of the commands you're going to run in the command line and stuff like that. It's your central main Node project file, since all this stuff is built on Node. And what I was trying to do when I said npm run, it looked for these scripts here, and then looked for the command that I had specified after that. So when I did this successfully, I wrote npm run dev. It looked in the scripts, found dev, and then it ran vite, essentially, which means like this is basically where you often have like sometimes more complicated commands that are getting your application running. Sometimes you need to pass in certain environment variables or like other bits of configuration. You can make these as complicated as you want, and you can write your own stuff here too. You can create your own scripts if you want in this. You probably won't need to, but as you start getting into more complex work, it might come up. So that's what we actually just did. We told it, look for the package.json file, look for the scripts, look for the thing called dev, run that command, and it ran vite, and then it worked. Vite in this case is one of our dependencies, which is why it knows what vite is. If I had tried to run this before I installed the original project, it would have given me an error because it wouldn't know what vite was. These dependencies here are all that ecosystem stuff I talked about, all that those third-party tools that other people wrote. Those live in here essentially, and when you are working with your repository here with other people, you're probably sharing it on GitHub or somewhere similar. Essentially, you don't actually take all of those third-party tools with you. You just have this right here. You have in the package.json your list of dependencies, and then when another person comes onto your project, they download this, and then they run the install command that then installs all this stuff locally. And that allows you all to sync up on exactly which versions of each tool you're using and have a whole history of that, and it's really great. So you don't need to worry about any of this right now, but that's just so you know what it is essentially. And then you have some other information here about like the name of your project and a few other things which you can alter at your will. None of that really matters at the moment. Cool. So once it starts running, then it loads up, this basic index file. That's what we're actually seeing here. So this index file doesn't really contain much of anything, as you can see. But as probably some of you know, when you traditionally do a web, just like a single web page, it's going to look for the index HTML as like its central page. And in this case, it's basically embedding the JSX that we mentioned earlier. What's the difference between package.json and package lock? Good question. So package.json contains the dependencies that we want to use. Package lock contains the ones we actually installed. This is a significant difference because some of these, you'll notice these like little carets here. There's this shorthand in here you'll see sometimes. And this stuff was just generated automatically by Vite. I didn't do this, but you can change this if you want. Like if I take this off, this means I'm using exactly React 18.2.0. Like that is the exact version I want to install here. But usually you don't want that. What you want is this, where it's like, I want kind of roughly that version. And that means that in some cases, if this React is available, 18.2.1, I think, I'm not totally sure about this, but basically it will allow me to upgrade. It will automatically upgrade a little bit higher if there's a newer version available. So these versions won't exactly line up with what I have. Package lock tells me this is exactly what I installed. And so you share, again, this is for like sharing with other people who are, or like if you're using multiple computers even, and it's just you want to make sure when I download the latest version of the code and I install everything it needs, I want to make sure that whatever I'm installing is exactly the versions that the last person was using, which is what the lock file is for essentially. That way you don't end up with like these slight little mismatches between things when maybe that a couple things changed in the dependency you're using and you need to change the code. And now suddenly you have this broken version because you have one version slightly lower. It's there to avoid that essentially. And you'll actually see variations on this in a lot of other different places. Like if you're doing a Ruby project, the gem file also has a lock file. Sometimes you will use yarn instead of npm. That's React itself bounces back and forth between which one it officially supports, and it's really annoying. But in fact, I think that's what yarn originally added. Was originally npm didn't have this lock file. Yarn added that lock file, and then npm added it too. So now you can use them interchangeably. So that was a very long response, but I hope that clarifies things. Does that make sense? Cool. So Yeah, so what the index file is grabbing is our main JSX here. And this is the sort of central, this is the center of our React app proper. If the package JSON is what centralizes like our node app we've created, then main here, at least in the case of Vite, I actually don't think that the normal create React app would necessarily do this, but like somewhere you're going to have this kind of main file, and you probably don't need to mess with this at all. But this is what's actually taking our React code and putting it onto the website, basically, onto in the index file, into the HTML. So you don't need to touch any of this. You just really need to know what's my main component, and that is app.jsx. So this is what we really care about. This is what we're actually seeing on screen here. And you can kind of see, you know, some of the text on here. Here's the logos. If you're familiar at all with HTML, this is really just, it's JSX, but this is just HTML for the most part. There's really nothing particularly different about it, except for anything that's in curly brackets like this. It's one of the biggest difference. And anything outside of this block here of the actual JSX, because everything outside of here, where you see stuff like all this is just straight up JavaScript. Really, the whole file is JavaScript. It's just like a special JavaScript where you can basically pepper in some HTML. And we'll go into exactly how that works. So from top to bottom, I just want to kind of go through how this file is structured. You'll notice there's a bunch of imports on the top. You're going to see a lot of that. If you want to talk to other files, the way that this is, you know, this is what's called scope. You might have talked a little bit about this. Anything that's inside this function, which is our actual component. I see a hand from the Tiger King.
I have a question. What is the impact of imports in these folders? Why? It seems like wisdom is to import as few as possible. Are they costly from a memory or performance perspective?
No, not really. Not that I've ever encountered. Yeah, that depends a lot. Like sometimes you will break up your complex component into multiple files as a way to like organize it for yourself, which will mean more imports somewhere. But no, for the most part, you don't really need to worry about using a lot of them. They can simply be usually you're ignoring them anyway. You're not really looking at them. They're not, all this is saying is like, hey, just pay attention to these files. I want the stuff that's in these files to be available in this current file. I'm unaware of any particular performance and impact from using a lot of them. I think it's pretty negligible. So in this case, we are both pulling in from React itself, which is one of our dependencies, one of those npm modules. Those all live here in this massive node modules folder that you should never have to touch. But that giant folder is all of the stuff that React pulls in. And I think React is complicated because it's using dependencies, and those dependencies are using dependencies, and it's this huge branching tree of all these different JavaScript dependencies from all sorts of different people. I think like there's probably like tens of thousands of files in here just from a basic React app that is currently doing nothing. And that is just it's kind of weird, but that's the reality of modern software development, is you're just sitting on top of this mountain of other people's code that you don't know what any of it does. And sometimes that's a little scary. But for the most part, it generally works, generally. So in this case, we're pulling stuff in from React, but we're also pulling it in from our local files. So you'll see we have the logo that we're showing here is coming in from our assets folder here, and that's just an SVG file. And then we also have a CSS file right here. And this is just normal CSS. There's nothing React-y about it specifically. This is just ordinary CSS you could also use on any other web page. React doesn't really have any direct control over that. It's not out of the box. And down here, you'll notice so we have a function called app. And then at the bottom, we have this statement that says export default app. This essentially is just making app, you know, the component available to other files that need it. And in this case, the only other file that needs it is main.jsx here. When it imports it, it can now use app. And you'll notice it looks like an HTML tag. This is the cool thing about JSX, is that once you created your own custom component, you can use it in markup in JSX the same way you would use something like a paragraph tag or an H1 or anything else. It just seamlessly mixes in, and this is why JSX is very, very cool. We'll start getting into some examples of how to use that. But But the real meat of this particular file is the app function, and you'll see it's a function. It used to be React used classes instead, class syntax for everything. So we would have a class, an app class that extended like a React component, and there'd be a whole bunch of other stuff in it. Gradually, React has moved away from this, but you might end up with some older projects that do still use it. We can talk a little bit about the difference. There really is not much of a use case for classes anymore, so you're probably going to mostly be using this, especially on anything newer. But essentially, they kind of do the same thing. This just kind of strips out a lot of the sort of rigmarole and gives you just something very simple. What this really is, this is a function ultimately that just returns JSX. It returns markup, or it returns null. It has to return something, because in JavaScript, if you don't return anything, you return undefined, and it's not okay with that. It will give you an error. In fact, I can show you right now what it does if I try to get rid of this block. So if I just comment this out and I open up our file here, I see nothing. Oh, it actually doesn't give me an error. Oh, wow, that's surprising. They changed that? Well, it definitely gives you an error in React Native, I'll tell you that much. Anyway, either way, we don't see anything, right? You notice the whole screen goes blank. All of that stuff we were looking at is in this block here that I just commented out. So when I bring it back, we get our actual view again. So we go through here. You'll notice line 6 here has some interesting stuff. We're not going to get to that just yet because that's part of the counter. This is part of the JavaScript-y stuff, and this is a very specific React hook we're using here to do this. That gives us some special functionality. We'll get to it in a second. Right, if we go down here, you'll notice again, this is just normal HTML. There's really nothing special about it, although you might notice this class name a lot. This is a big difference between React and just normal HTML. The thing is, because of that class stuff I mentioned, the fact that React used to use classes, and just the way JavaScript works, class is like a reserved word. You can't just use class like you normally would as a CSS class in HTML. So React has done this class name thing as just kind of like a way to get around that, essentially. But it means the same thing. If those of you who are familiar with CSS classes and how they work, it's exactly the same thing. Like this is a CSS class. You can tell because it starts with a dot instead of a pound sign or hashtag there. And it works exactly the same way it normally would. You just have to change that one little thing. So if you're familiar with HTML stuff, it might be a little bit confusing at first. If you're not, then you don't need to worry about it. So what this is doing here is it's just doing normal. This is just totally normal HTML, nothing special about it. And then when we get down here, we have that button, that click button, which again, I'm going to show you exactly how it works. And then this is the first time you see these curly braces, and you see it again down here. Count is count, right? So this essentially means that we are taking JavaScript and we're kind of putting it right in the middle of our markup. And anything that JavaScript returns, anything it sends back, is going to appear on screen, or at least it's going to try to render it. The thing about HTML and JavaScript is the kind of philosophy behind them that's important to remember, especially if you eventually move on to other types of software. Like they just try to kind of carry on no matter what. They do their best not to show errors to the user. They do their best to just like try to interpret whatever you give them and just keep chugging along, which is sometimes nice and sometimes horrible because it can sometimes make it very hard to debug problems. Other frameworks will sometimes just like flat out tell you, no, you can't do this. You screwed up. You need to fix this. And JavaScript rarely does that. So anything you put in curly braces, it's going to do its best to try to like pull something out of that and show something to the user. So just keep in mind that's what it's doing when we go through this. I see a question. Class name refers directly to app CSS. Yeah, well, it in this case, it's more of the opposite. This just tells tells the renderer that this particular div here has a class name of app, right? If there is nothing in app CSS that refers to that, it won't do anything. Like I could change it right now actually to app2, and when I do that, actually nothing happens. What is app actually doing here? Oh, actually that's already the case. Yeah, see, there's nothing in app CSS that does anything. I can add it, So for those of you, yeah, so I'm going to add an app class here, and I'm just going to change the background color to red. Okay, so there we go. So if that class name is present in the CSS, it will apply that styling to that part of our app. If it's not, it doesn't care. It just doesn't do anything. So really, it's up to the CSS to sort of decorate the HTML, not the other way around, if that makes any sense. So yes, again, so here we can already see the results of that, the curly braces value, right? Count is 0. That value here is being set up here. And again, I'll get into how this is, but essentially like this particular call here, this is just JavaScript, is creating a variable called count. And it's also creating a function called set count, which we can use to change the count. And it's giving it an initial value of 0. I can actually just comment this out and do something a little simpler and just say count equals 100, for example. I'm using a constant here, but you might also see let or var. These are also ways that JavaScript can create a variable, but in my case, I'm saying it's a constant, which means I don't expect it to change. Not something we really need to worry about, and this is not React specific, just trying to make sure that everything I do makes sense. And you'll see it changes to that. So this is just telling us currently in the state of the app what this value is, and that's all it is. I see a hand.
Hey, how's it going? Quick question. Is it common to see on the button there that built-in function on click, or making your own function?
Yeah, so on click, this is interesting because we're going to start seeing the same thing as we build our own components. This is built into the HTML button tag. There's an on click handler, and you put a function that then handles the click, does something with the click. In this case, it sets our count to count +1, which is how that counter works. So actually that will still work. Actually, it won't work anymore because I just got rid of that thing. But if we go back to how it was when I started, here we go. So this is functional because that on-click handler, and that is built into HTML. That's just built into how the browser understands that. We didn't create that. But I think the question was kind of, is it normal to put were you asking like, is it normal to put the logic right in here versus creating a function somewhere else that's like function on click and then putting that same?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So it depends. I think that if it's complicated at all, I'm doing mixing my styling here. Okay. So here what I've done is I've just moved that into a separate function. And this is actually very similar to how you separate components. In fact, this is exactly how you separate components in React. So we're going to get into this in a second. Yeah, you can take any function and then I break everything, of course. What did I do? So a good thing to learn here is to jump into this console here. Hopefully you can see that. And anytime because sometimes React will give you actual errors on screen. Sometimes it won't, and you have to dig into your console to see them. But they will be somewhere. They will exist. In this case, we have 500 internal server error. That's interesting. Really? What did I do? Okay, I just needed to refresh. So, okay, another thing that's going on here. When I made that change to this file, Vite or React itself or whatever, I don't know, Vite might be doing some slightly different stuff here, but React will also work this way if you're just running a regular React project. It is using a tool called Watchmen to constantly watch all of your files for any changes. And anytime you save a file, it will automatically make note of that, and it will refresh your page. It'll do like a hot reload, essentially. So you don't even need to go back in here and hit refresh to see your changes. Sometimes that breaks, or sometimes you make a change, you save when you have some broken code, and then you save it with some working code, but the broken code broke the site enough that it won't refresh correctly. So if things are acting really wonky, it's usually good to just hit refresh and just make sure that it isn't just a problem with the hot reloading. Most of the time it's not an issue, but it does come up. Like in that case, I have no idea what that actual problem was. That was like a Vite specific issue I've never seen. I forget what I was doing. Oh yeah, right. So I moved that. So I have the same functionality as before, this on click, but I've moved it out of there into a separate function, which I've declared inside the function app. You'll notice you can declare a function inside a function. You can do that infinitely if you want. All that means is that only the app function can access this function. I can also move it out here. this is kind of important because this is how scope works in JavaScript. Now the entire file can use this, including app. If I have another component in here, it will also have access to this. And when I hit this, oh, it breaks. Great. So what did I do wrong? Oh no, I'm totally wrong. Actually, I did need to keep that inside there. Again, this is the scope issue. Yeah, let's take a look at what I actually did wrong here. Remember that set count function I mentioned that got created? That's the function that React created for me to allow me to increment the count to get it higher. That doesn't exist anymore because I moved the function outside here, and the set count exists inside app. So now I'm still able to click it. You'll notice it didn't give me any errors until I clicked it. This is part of the problem. This is the same thing I was talking about with HTML and JavaScript and generally the web trying to keep going. It didn't give me like a compiler error or stop me before I did anything. You don't usually get that. Most of your problems are going to happen when the app tries to do something. So in this case, it got all this way here. It saw me saying, hey, I want to set count. And it's like, well, I don't know what that is because set count exists inside of app. OnClick is now floating out here freely in the file. It doesn't know anything that exists in app. It only knows what exists in the file or itself. So this is one of the things that you have to consider if you're moving the functionality outside of that block here. The nice thing about having it right in here is I know it has all of the same information that all the code around it has. And in this case, that's also true because it's inside the app, but this is what happens when you start splitting things up. They need to be able to talk to each other, and sometimes you lose those connections. Hopefully this is making sense to everybody. I'm kind of jumping ahead a little more advanced than I normally would get this quickly. All right, let's see if this works. Okay, great. So now this works again. But it really is kind of a stylistic, to answer your question, it's kind of a stylistic concern. You know, you probably want as little logic in your markup as you can put there. So generally, if it's complicated, if it's more than this is like one line of code, it's not very much. But if it was a lot of code, if it was doing a bunch of different stuff, like maybe it was also making an API call, maybe it was doing this and that, it would make a lot more sense to put it into a separate function so you could just have that in its own place. And then here, all you are concerned about is when I click this button, this function gets called, and that's it. Oh, cool. Sounds like you went over state and props yesterday. Great. Yeah, normally I talk a bit about state and props. So you already used the hook. Have you actually used use state hooks and stuff? You didn't do it in the old class-based way?
Yeah, we used the use state hook.
Great. Did you talk about what this actually means? Because even I didn't know what this meant for a while, like why it's inside of an array.
You could explain that.
This is something I think is helpful. I don't know, maybe it doesn't bother you, but it bothered me for a while. I was like, what am I looking at here? Where do these come from? And what you're seeing here is called object, or I guess array destructuring. It's something that JavaScript does, which is kind of cool, where essentially it's like a way to just like split things up onto one line so you can pull out stuff you want from a complicated object that's coming back right away without having to deal with anything. What you're actually seeing here is basically this. You're seeing like you're seeing a count array here come back from useState. useState, gives you back an array with two elements, and that first element is a variable, and the second element is a function that changes, that sets that variable, right? So then what I could do it this way instead to make it a little longer. Like I'm getting back this array, and count is count array at the 0 index, and set count is count array at the first index. So those of you who know how arrays work, like this will probably look more familiar to you. That's actually what's happening here. We're just doing it on one line. So if I go back into here, hopefully this will still work. Yeah, it's the exact same thing. The reason it gives you an array and not like an object is because they want you to be able to name these yourself. Since an array element is, it just becomes, when you destructure an array, it just becomes whatever name you give it. And that's important here because it's your variable. You know what it means, and you need to be able to understand it. The other time you might see this sometimes, this destructuring, is when you have an object where it's like this, where it's like, like a JavaScript object that has like keys and values. And I could do this same kind of thing here to destructure the object and pull hello out in this case, right? But this, I can't change this because you're gonna see a lot of stuff like this actually, where you're pulling out keys or really you're pulling out the values, you're pulling out part of a big object that has a whole big long list of things, and you only want a few of the things. But I can't change the name of this. That key is set. So this is why they send you back an array and why the syntax might look a little strange. So hopefully that makes sense. I just realized it was a long time before I even knew exactly what I was looking at here. And that made it just a lot easier for me to understand what I was doing here. I think somebody had a question that might have gotten missed. Safe to keep autosave on in VS Code when working with React. I don't use autosave, so, but it's probably fine. Like I said, you might get, I don't know, what does it autosave like every time you type, or when does it do it?
I think it's every time you type, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, like you may end up with more issues like this where it sort of saves in a weird state that causes an error that it's unable to recover from. Usually it's pretty good about that. Even if you do something totally broken, if you save the right file, it'll fix itself. But yeah, you may just need to manually reload a few more times. That's always the first thing to do. If things are acting really weird, try reloading. If it's still acting really weird, try stopping the server and starting it again. You kind of just jiggle things and unplug them and plug them back in and see if you really have a problem sometimes before you start digging into your code, because little things like that can lead you astray. Cool. So I think actually it's been about a little over an hour now. I would love to take a quick break if that's cool with everybody and come back in about 5 minutes. And then we'll start getting into how we can pull these components apart into separate components and start using the magic of JSX. Any other questions before we take this quick break? Cool. Okay. Well, I'll see you all in 5 minutes.